Mr. Speaker.
Call Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Speaker, well, I have to start by saying that this legislation has introduced a rare outbreak of consensus to the House, at least thus far. And even after that scintillating address from Mr. Goldsmith, I don't think we'll see many people marching in the street over this legislation. Despite Mr. Goldsmith is telling us he spoke with gravitas, and I'll let the viewers at home make their own assessment. But as I say, that there won't be people marching in the street, I don't think, even after that scintillating address with gravitas, in the way that there are people upset by, say, the GCSB legislation, which we've seen before this House today. Understand 66,000 people signed in on an online petition there, and that was nearly twice as many as debated snapper. But this piece of legislation attracted just four submissions, Mr. Speaker, which is a long way, I think members of this House will agree, from the number and interest in those other areas which I shan't go any further into at this point. Mr. Goldsmith himself is to be congratulating for steering this legislation through. I didn't have the privilege of sitting on this committee as it dealt with this legislation, but I have worked with many of the members on it before, and I know that they do work well and constructively together, and they have brought this bill back to the House very quickly. If this side of the House were to be critical at all of the way in which this bill has progressed, it would be the stopping and starting nature of its progress. Mr. Goldsmith says there's no need for that, but I think the viewers at home should understand that this bill does come into effect to take over from the transitional period which the previous Act covered, that expires in September this year. And so suddenly there is an urgency to get this bill through the House. It is housekeeping legislation, as Mr. Parker has drawn attention to, but it's housekeeping legislation that is now being rushed through due to the perhaps incompetence of the government's management of the House. And we certainly have seen a lot of urgency and extended House time in the House this year, and also in terms of the legislation itself, a lot of Henry VIII clauses in the legislation, certainly in the IRD stuff that has been dealt with through that same committee, dealing with matters related in terms of revenue and so forth. We've seen clauses in the legislation which has been intended to cover up for stuff-ups that might subsequently happen. Certainly the student loans area has seen lots of legislation which hasn't been able to be implemented and has subsequently caused the government embarrassment, and so it's become fond of these Henry VIII clauses. I'm pleased to say there's none in this particular piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and that is because it is a very simple piece of legislation which has widespread agreement, and that is simply tidying up a couple of simple matters. Now, in the area that the Reserve Bank is getting the powers, it is to do with monetary policy. Now, we do know that there are a number of things that are not in this legislation that might be, in fact, more useful and more usefully debated, perhaps if the government were able to get legislation through the House in a useful time frame and in an orderly manner, and not stopping and starting. We would in fact be debating in more depth the use of macro-prudential tools such as those announced today by the government, those LVRs that will shut more first home buyers out of the market, because these are important issues. The things that the Reserve Bank deals with that are dealt with here in this legislation do affect a lot of people, either directly or indirectly. That this bill contains amendments which are largely technical issues, including requiring the Reserve Bank to keep a register of licensed insurers. It is very difficult to object to such a measure, I have to say, Mr. Speaker. This bill also contains amendments that empower the Reserve Bank to give notice to an insurer that allows the insurer to prepare these interim financial information in accordance with requirements other than the New Zealand Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, or GAAP. that Mr Goldsmith referred to. And it also extends the term of provisional licences of insurers that enter into an insolvency procedure before 7th of September 2013. Now, no one would argue that any of these things should not be in the legislation. We really would only be more concerned with what is not in the legislation in terms of the Reserve Bank's powers, because if the Reserve Bank were given more powers to be more flexible in the area of monetary policy, we might have a more up-to-date and 21st century policy which kept pace with the rest of the world. And Mr Parker raised the matter of the primacy of inflation targeting. I note Mr Goldsmith had nothing to say in response to that, and the lack of economic growth and the lack of employment opportunities that this 1980s legislation has introduced and failed to correct for over time. And governments of all stripes have failed to address this issue fully, in my view, but it falls again to the Labour Party to raise these issues, to ask why it's not in this piece of legislation, why we are not addressing these big issues in this House, why we are stopping and starting to take pieces of housekeeping legislation like this through when we might otherwise be debating bigger issues, the kinds of issues around economic growth and employment that see, in my area down in Dunedin, the loss of 85 jobs at Invermay as ag research funding is withdrawn.
Order. This is a second reading speech, and a second reading is what's come back from the Select Committee. So I ask the member to confine his comments to that. Dr David Clark.
Sorry, Mr Speaker, I understand that the Select Committee did have a discussion about monetary policy and its wider implications, which I am alluding to. And I apologise if I am spreading that debate too widely, but these are important matters. So the Labour Party will support this legislation. We recognise that it's a sensible bill. That's why we supported it through to the Select Committee. That's why our members heard those submissions. That's why our members described them as housekeeping. That's why our members questioned why there might not be a little bit more in this bill that actually would support our exporters so that we could have an export-led recovery in the fashion that the government talks about but has failed to deliver upon. We've discussed also the insurance industry here and the shift from a 1 in 500 year to a 1 in 1,000 year cover, and there can be no disagreement with the importance of ensuring that New Zealand has adequate insurance cover, has an industry-friendly policy so that insurers are not faced with undue red tape when delivering their policy to New Zealand, and no doubt that has been taken into account in the exemptions around GAP that have been proposed, and that I'm sure will be discussed further by Mr Bennett when it comes time for his contribution, which many in this House will listen to with great interest, as with so many of his contributions on insurance matters in the Finance and Expenditure Committee. Well, Mr Chair, it comes to the end of this contribution, and I do wish to again stress that the Labour government will be supporting this bill despite the reservations I have raised with the House and other members have raised in terms of the completeness of the legislation, in terms of its failure to address those broader issues of economic growth and employment that are affected by monetary policy that is put through this House. This is housekeeping legislation. It's not a hands-on approach. It's not hands-on in the way that some of the other areas are being dealt with. We think of the TY smelter or the GCSB. There's a much more active role being taken by government. But it is legislation that needs to go through this House. It's legislation that we welcome, that makes those changes, that will make it easier for insurers to be here, to make sure that New Zealanders are supported through good times and bad, and we think particularly of those who have been affected by the recent earthquakes in Wellington and the fears they may have and be carrying that are in some small way alleviated by having insurers available and able to share some of the risk that goes with living in these shaky isles. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Call
Mr.
Dr.
Speaker.
Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.